into the fire, face up to the empty promise, walk a little wiser, fight harder than you're not, right into the fire, strike down through the burning borders, rings head ever tighter, come carry me forward now. This is the moment I've been waiting for. Out of the hands of fate, I'm tearing into truth. This is the moment I've been waiting for. Follow the future, start the bleed, I'm cutting loose. This is the time that I've been waiting for. This is the moment I've been waiting for.
Welcome to the first episode of Commandosaurus. I'm your host Alex, and today we have a very special list of competitors with a wide array of power level in their decks. So let's see if it's going to be a fair matchup and how they will fare. First up, we have Robert, who is going to be the starting player in this match, and he has brought his Titania Voice of Gaia deck, a high-powered lance meta deck with a lot of expensive cards. Let's see how it will fare against the other ones, because next will be myself with Runadi, Behemoth Caller, or as I like to call it, Worm Caller, because it's a worm tribal deck. All about big creatures, card draw, and, killing people with not that many attacks. Oliver, who is going third in this match, is going to play one of his favorite decks based upon Nicol Bolas the Ravager, filled not only with pretty much every card that has Nicol Bolas as a planeswalker creature, but also a lot of thematic things from his reign in a certain Egyptian-inspired plane. This is Grixis control at its finest, so let's see what he's going to bring to the table. And last but not least will be Kevin, a very new player to the game, who brought his Atarka World Render deck, which is pretty much the starter deck with a very slight upgrade. But never underestimate a deck when dragons are involved, because it might have a very, very high power and attack level. With that being said, let's start off the game. The first turn begins, and Robert is putting into the battlefield a Verdant Catacombs. He then proceeds to tap it, pay 1 life, and sacrifice it immediately to fetch a forest from his deck, which will enter the battlefield untapped. He then passes to Alex. Alex puts into the battlefield a forest and then uses this forest to cast a Soul Ring, and will pass the turn to Oliver. Oliver is putting into the battlefield an Urborg Volcano tapped, and then proceeds to suspend a Lotus Bloom with 3 time counters on it. With this he passes to Kevin, who will put a forest onto the battlefield and pass to Robert. Round 2 begins with Robert putting onto the battlefield a forest, and then casting 3 visits to find another forest from his library and put it onto the battlefield untapped. With this he passes to Alex, who is also putting another forest onto the battlefield, and with this casts Nature's Lore. This will, just like 3 visits, find him a forest from his library and puts it onto the battlefield untapped as well. Afterwards he casts Runadi, Behemoth Caller, from his command zone and is the first player to put his commander onto the battlefield. With this he will pass to Oliver, who during his upkeep will remove a time counter from his Lotus Bloom. Afterwards he puts into the battlefield a Terramorphic Expanse, immediately tapping it and sacrificing it to find an tapped swamp from his library and puts it onto the battlefield. With this he passes to Kevin, who is putting into play a Timber Gorge, which enters tapped. He then passes to Robert. Round 3 comes along, and Robert is going to start off with a forest he puts onto the battlefield from his hand. Afterwards he casts Titania Voice of Gaia from his command zone and is the second player to enter his commander onto the battlefield. With this he will pass to Alex. Alex begins by putting a forest onto the battlefield and then casts Bow of Nilea, which will give all his attacking creatures Death Touch and have a little bit of utility. Afterwards he is casting Court of Bounty, which will give him some free stuff during his upkeep with a little bit of luck. Also, when it enters the battlefield, it will make him the Monarch, introducing everybody's favorite mechanic to the game. In his end step, because he's the Monarch, he will draw a card and then pass his turn to Oliver, who will remove another time counter from his Lotus Bloom. Then he puts into play an island from his hand and casts Dimir Signet for a little bit more mana variety. He then uses the Signet and a little bit of mana to put an Izzet Signet into play as well. With this, he passes to Kevin, who is just putting another mountain onto the battlefield, and then proceeds to cast his first spell, which is the Carnelian Orb of Dragonkind, a mana rock that can give his dragons haste. He then passes to Robert. The fourth turn begins, and Robert puts into the battlefield a forest from his hand and then casts Growing Rites of Itlimok. When this card enters the battlefield, he looks at the top 4 cards of his library and finds a Courser of Krufix, which is going to be put into his hand. The rest goes to the bottom of his library. He then proceeds to cast the Courser of Krufix and then enters combat. He decides to attack Alex with his commander Titania for free commander damage, taking the Monarch in the process. He then ends his turn, and because he is now the Monarch, he will draw a card and pass his turn to Alex. Alex, during his upkeep, decides to put a forest onto the battlefield because of Court of Bounty. He then goes straight into combat and decides to attack Robert with Runadi Behemoth Caller for 1 commander damage, taking back the Monarch in the process. Afterwards, he casts a Reclamation Sage during his second main phase, and when it enters the battlefield, he decides to destroy the Growing Rites of Itlimok because it has way too much potential in a longer game. After that has happened, he casts Seraph the Viper's Fang for a bit more Death Touch and Hexproof on his creatures and a little bit of utility. Because he now is again the Monarch, he will draw a card before he ends his turn and then pass to Oliver. Oliver removes the last time counter from his Lotus Bloom, which is now cast and enters the battlefield. He will sacrifice it during his turn to add 3 black mana to his mana pool and then proceed to cast Nicol Bolas the Ravager from his command zone. When it enters the battlefield, all his opponents now have to discard a card. After this has happened, he casts another spell, the Loyal Subordinate, which is a creature that enters the battlefield and, once combat starts, will activate, and each opponent will lose 3 life because his commander is on the battlefield. Afterwards, he passes the turn to Kevin, who will cast a Cultivate, searching for a forest and a mountain from his deck. The forest will enter the battlefield tapped, the mountain will go to his hand. He then plays that mountain as his land for turn and pass the turn to Robert. The 5th turn comes around and Robert begins by putting onto the battlefield another forest. This will trigger the Courser of Krufix and gain him 1 life. Afterwards, he casts Scapeshift, sacrificing all his forests, which he tapped completely beforehand, and then fetches 6 new tapped lands, which will be 2 basic forests, a Thespian Stage, Argoth, and the Dark Depths, as well as the Field of the Dead. This will have a lot of trigger happen. First up, Dark Depths will enter the battlefield and give itself 10 ice counters. Afterward, he will gain a total of 6 life because of the Courser of Krufix, and since 6 lands were sacrificed and landed in his graveyard, Titania will give him an additional 2 life points. After that, he casts Sakura Tribe Elder and will go to combat, where Titania is looking for another fight, and he chooses to attack Kevin this time, dealing 3 commander damage to him. Afterwards, he passes to Alex, who during his upkeep will gain nothing from his Court of Bounty, and then proceeds to cast Impervious Great Worm using Seraph as part of the convo cost. This will also activate Runadi and will make sure that the Great Worm is entering with some more power. And it will gain 6 +1/+1 counters when it enters the battlefield and also has haste because of Runadi's passive ability. He then proceeds to go into combat and chooses to attack Oliver with his Impervious Great Worm. Oliver decides to block with his Loyal Subordinate, so he takes no damage. At the end of his turn, because he's the Monarch, Alex will draw a card and pass his turn to Oliver. He will begin by casting a Mana Lift for a little bit more ramp, and then cast a Mana Geode, which is also a Mana Rock. When it enters the battlefield, he looks at the top card of his library. He then goes into combat as well, and Nicol Bolas is hungry for a little bit of action himself and decides to attack Alex for 4 commander damage. This will make Oliver the Monarch. And during his end step, he will draw a card because of this and pass his turn to Kevin. Kevin will then play a mountain as his land for turn and cast Beast Within, destroying Robert's Dark Depths and giving him a free Beast token. This will activate Titania, so Robert will gain another 2 life. Also, before Kevin ends his turn, he sacrifices the Sakura Tribe Elder to fetch a tapped forest from his library. Also, because of this, Course of Kufix triggers and he gains another life. With this, Kevin passes the turn. Turn 6 begins, and during his upkeep, Titania now has her conditions fulfilled. Argov is on the battlefield and he has 4 or more lands in the graveyard, so she will melt and become Titania Gaia Incarnate. When this creature enters the battlefield, he will put all of his lands from the graveyard onto the battlefield tapped, which are 6 basic lands, Dark Depths and the Verdant Catacombs. This has a little bit of trigger action, and Dark Depths again enters with 10 ice counters. But Robert, in all his joy and glory, forgets the 8 Courser of Kufix triggers and will sadly not gain any life points. This, however, will not matter that much during the game. He then puts a Reliquary Tower onto the battlefield for a little bit of hand size improvement. This will gain him a life from the Courser of Kufix. He then proceeds to activate the Thespian stage, copying his Dark Depths. Because of the legendary rule, he now decides to sacrifice the Dark Depths copy, aka Thespian stage, and since it had no ice counters on it, he will create Marit Large. He then proceeds to combat and wants to spread a little bit of the love around, attacking Kevin with Titania Gaia Incarnate for 14 commander damage and Alex with his Course of Kufix and Beast for a total of 5 damage. He then puts onto the battlefield a Predator Ooze and passes the turn to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex uses the Call of Bounty to put another forest onto the battlefield. He then casts 3 visits and finds another forest, which will enter the battlefield untapped. With this, he casts the Duskdale Worm, and this will trigger Runadi, who wants to put some +1/+1 counters if the worm enters the battlefield, which it does, so now it is a 10/10. He then goes into combat, and since the Duskdale Worm has haste, he decides to use him and his slightly bigger worm for a little bit more damage. He attacks Kevin with the Duskdale Worm for 10 damage and also Oliver with the Imperious Great Worm for 22 damage. Because of this, he will regain the Monarch and during his end step will draw a card because of this. He then passes to Oliver, who will put into the battlefield a Command Tower, followed by casting a Palladium Myr for even more ramp. After that, he's casting Patient Rebuilding in the hopes that it will draw him some cards along the way. With this, he passes to Kevin, who proceeds to cast Atarka World Render from his command zone using the Carnelian Orb for red mana, giving her haste. With this, he goes straight into combat and decides to attack Alex with Atarka. He will gain 6 commander damage for the first strike damage, which will put the Monarch onto Kevin for the first time, and after this has resolved, Alex will suffer another 6 commander damage. With this, he will end the turn and pass to Robert. Turn 7 runs along, and Robert begins the turn by casting Titania's Command. He decides for the first mode to put 2 +1/+1 counters on all his creatures, which improves his beast, the Courser of Kufix, the Predator Ooze, Titania Incarnate and Marit Large, and then use the second mode to find 2 lands from his library and put them onto the battlefield tapped, which will be a Blast Zone and the Myriad Landscape. This has a little bit of trigger action starting, because the Field of the Dead will now trigger for the first time and put 2 zombie tokens onto the battlefield. The Blast Zone will put 1 charge counter on itself, and the Course of Kufix will trigger twice and give him a total of 2 life points. He then goes into combat and, seeing if he can maybe take out at least 1 player, attacks all of them at once. He decides to attack Kevin with the Beast token and the Predator Ooze, Oliver with the Courser of Kufix and Marit Large, and Titania Gaia Incarnate shall attack Alex, which would theoretically kill him. However, before any of this can happen, Predator Ooze will trigger and put another +1/+1 counter on itself. On the switch to the Declare Block step, Alex activates Seraph the Viper's Fang's ability and untaps his Impervious Great Worm, enabling him to block Titania Gaia Incarnate, killing her in the process. Oliver decides to block the Quasar with the Palladium Mirror, and Nicol Bolas shall block Marit Large. Sadly, both of them are not strong enough and will die as well. Kevin cannot block and will suffer 9 damage from the 2 attacking creatures. Because he dealt damage to Kevin, Robert is now getting the Monarch token. Just like Kevin, however, he will forget to draw the card at the end of the turn, which will be corrected in a few steps along the way. Since it didn't matter that much, stuff like that can happen. During his second main phase, he will cast Pulse of Murasa and decides to put Titania Voice of Gaia from his graveyard back to his hand. However, because he seems to have so much life that he does not care that much, he forgets to give himself the 6 life from this card. Again, mistakes happen in the game. He then casts Titania Voice of Gaia from his hand for the normal cost and passes the turn to Alex. With his Court of Bounty effect and upkeep, he will again draw a blank and cannot put anything onto the battlefield because the forest he drew as his card for turn will be played normally. He then casts Elemental Wand for the hope of a little bit card draw during the late game. After this, he proceeds to cast Roaring Flagworm, which will trigger Runadi and put some +1/+1 counters on that worm when it enters the battlefield. But before this happens, he draws a card from Elemental Wand, and then the Roaring Flagworm will become a 9/7 creature. He then goes into combat, and seeing that the game might be almost over already, he's going to make an all-out attack into Robert's direction, attacking him with the Impervious Great Worm, the Reclamation Sage, the Roaring Slagworm and the Dustdale Worm. This has an attack trigger by the Roaring Slagworm, who will now tap all artifacts on the battlefield, but since they were already tapped, nothing will happen. Robert decides to block the Impervious Great Worm and the Roaring Slagworm with his 2 zombie tokens, which will die, but since those worms did not have trample, nothing much will happen except the damage from the Reclamation Sage and Dustdale Worm, which is at least 12 total. With this, Alex will regain Monarch for another time this turn, and then ends his turn to draw a card because of the Monarch rule and pass his turn to Oliver. During his upkeep, Patient Rebuilding will trigger and he decides to choose Robert as his target. Robert mills 3 cards from his deck, but since only 1 land card is milled this way, Oliver draws only 1 card. He then proceeds to cast Mox Amber for free and puts another mountain onto the battlefield. With all the mana he has, he casts Army of the Damned, putting 13 tapped black zombie tokens onto the battlefield. He then passes to Kevin, who will put a forest onto the battlefield and then proceeds to cast Dracoseth Maw of Flames using his Carnelian Orb, so he has haste. On the switch to the combat phase, Robert will pay 1 life and sacrifice his Verdant Catacombs to fetch another untapped forest from his deck, which will activate Titania first, as we've seen before, and give him 2 life. Since the forest enters the battlefield afterwards, he will gain another life because of the Courser of Crufix. We then go into the Declare Attacker step, and Kevin decides to attack Oliver with Dracoseth and Alex with Atarka. This activates Dracoseth's ability, and Kevin decides to deal 4 damage to Oliver and 3 damage to Robert and Alex each. On the switch to the Declare Blocker step, just because it worked well the first time, Alex decides to activate Seraph the Viper's Fang again to untap his Impervious Great Worm once again, which sadly will not do a lot of help because the dragons can just fly through. Because they have double strike, they will deal their first strike damage first, and Oliver will suffer 7 damage and Alex will suffer 6 commander damage. This will switch the Monarch back to Kevin. After this has happened, they hit their targets once again, killing Oliver and Alex in the process. With this, he passes the turn and Robert will start the next round. During his turn, Robert goes straight into the combat phase and decides to attack Kevin with Titania Voice of Gaia for 3 commander damage, securing the win. Good game everybody, a valiant effort to fight against one another. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you had a good time, and if you learned one thing from this video, mistakes happen, it's part of the fun, enjoy.